your interest in my talk. So I realized there are a few externals in this. And so for those who, Susan said it, but for those who don't know, I've been working here for about 4.5 years, and I will take new academic positions in Berlin and Potsdam very soon, next month. So I thought I'd do a more personal, perhaps, farewell talk. And so this is today a bit of an overview what I did and what I want to do in the future. Let me caveat that, especially if you're external, you don't know me, it's in a sense a dangerous talk to give. Because I will, do the dangerous thing and try to say everything in 30 to 40 minutes, maybe more like 40 minutes. And scholars who try to say everything are typically to be distrusted. So don't take this super seriously. And, you can ask as a kind of meta question, if I get something right, is it worse that I get a lot wrong? And perhaps we can discuss this. But, if you're a graduate student, I see my students are all here. Don't do this at the job market. You can do this kind of talk, perhaps if you leave an institute. That's just the preface, the caveat. Here's the outline. So I'm going to show, inspired by the psychologist Jonathan Haidt, what the two main dominant narratives about capitalism are, which are about exploitation and liberation concerns of capitalism. And then I'll say that I believe there's a kind of liberation bias in the kind of neoclassical theory we use. So that actually the theory we learn from the textbooks in neoclassical economics has some sort of bias towards the liberation ideas. But that correcting for that would sort of basically give us old economic thinking. That's what I'll argue in the first part. Then in the second part, I'll say, though, the way we typically think about policy evaluation across economics and philosophy has some sort of exploitation bias, though, and I wonder, and I want to discuss with you whether that's sort of an angle for new economic thinking. In the final 2 minutes, I'll present an agenda, slightly in an ironic tone, what I want to do in the next 5 or more years, and then I'll conclude with a thought about the third story there should be. So I will not start with capitalism, but I will start with philosophy and moral psychology, where David Hume, 3 centuries ago, in one of the most famous passages in modern philosophy, wrote that reason is and ought to be only the slave of the passions. Much in contrast to much other Western philosophy, and in more modern parlance, you could perhaps say he meant to say, we can't change a feeling with a fact. Now, the recent psychology and neuroscience of morality around the past 20 years does suggest to me that Hume was at least partially right, perhaps more right than wrong, although he wasn't always right. And so I'll derive that from what's now the established kind of model in moral psychology, which is the social intuitionist model, which does tell you there's intuitive primacy in moral and political reactions, but not dictatorship. And especially also that moral thinking is really for social doing, not especially for truth seeking. So very briefly, and what's sort of been the change, the attitude to how do people react to political and moral issues is really to say, once there's a situation in which your political moral views get elicited, your intuition comes first, then comes your judgment of the issue, and then comes your reasoning. Sometimes the reasoning influences the judgment, and sometimes it can even revise the intuition. So this is why there's no intuitive dictatorship. But especially this is also a social thing. If moral thinking is for social doing, then your reasoning and your judgment will also influence first the intuition of others, that influences their judgment, and then comes the reasoning, and the reasoning often more defends the judgment than actually first you do the reasoning, then you do the judgment, which is a more rationalist version. Why do I do this? Because I want to, from that starting point, say, well, if that's sort of how people really react to questions of policy and morality, maybe there's something more fundamental underlying our theories in economics that ultimately sort of people's intuitions, people's reactions to the basic narratives they hear are very simple. And so if almost anyone sort of reacts intuitively to things about what we typically study here, economic policy systems, then I would say there's some truth in this idea that intuitively most people you meet either like or dislike capitalism. And so in the blurb to the talk, I linked to these videos. If I would give this talk in real life in a seminar room, we would now watch these videos together for some various sharing mishaps. I think Susan would tell me off to do this. I've not planned today to share these videos. In case you haven't watched them before the talk, do watch them afterwards, because they really sort of get you into different mindset what that means. Most people do tend to have either this intuition that capitalism, oh, that's really just a story about exploitation. We're exploiting nature, we're exploiting workers, and we have to stop ever rising inequality. While the other half, if you intuitively like capitalism, then you probably associate this with the glorification of entrepreneurship. Capitalism has liberated us from poverty. Free trade is good for creating more wealth. And these are the basic elements in that. And now, of course, as a social science scholar, my claim is not a kind of varieties of capitalism literature is misplaced. And certainly the relationship between markets and states differs in many forms between various countries. This is more about the underlying psychology. How do real people react to policy proposals about the economy? And I believe for that, there's quite a lot of truth in that. Surveys indicate, perhaps, and this is sort of perhaps also a view John Haidt would take, that the exploitation story is currently more fashionable. It's perhaps also easier to understand. So I've just put up a poll here about what do people really think of capitalism. And in a diverse set of countries, some rich Western countries, but also some others, you get substantial majorities of the population to agree in all nations that the poor get poorer in capitalist economies. Highly dubious claim for social science scholars, that to save our own economies, we should have more protectionist policies, and the large companies behave unethically. This is what large majorities of the population believes in this diverse set of countries. You also do get, as an element of the second story, though less impressive majorities, that markets are better than states in reducing poverty. Historically, though, I think it's hard to deny that the liberation story is perhaps closer to the truth, as would also be made plain by our alumnus Max Rosa of Our World in Data, who has shown this graph many times to the media and say, historically, capitalism is a spectacular success story, because even in absolute terms, the number of people living in absolute poverty is falling. In this context, I also typically like to link, by way of motivation, to the work of Sam Bowles, who in his lifetime synthesis in 2016 on the moral economy really sort of gave quite a strong verdict on how should we think about capitalism and human nature. Because his, to me, is the ultimate answer to the question, which I'm not going to discuss further than here today, does capitalism change human nature for better or worse? Which has attracted many scholars. And there is, on the one hand, one truth to the story, that to say humans who are used to monetary incentives act more egoistically. And this is about economic students who read economics, then actually in the lab act more egoistically when they play games. So that's true to an extent. On the other hand, he also documents, though, that the humans who live in wealthy societies of the present day show in general a much greater concern for extending altruism to society, not just to their local tribe. And that's interesting. So in a sense, he gives an empirically grounded explanation of, on the one hand, the kind of Marxian alienation story, which is an element of exploitation, to say monetary incentives really alienate people from their values, while on the other hand, you have someone like Montesquieu, who wrote, where there's commerce, the ways of men are gentle, and only made that point that perhaps all this trade, all this anonymous abstract exchanges actually make people more altruistic to the broader society and overcome nepotism and other things. So the task ahead for this talk, but then also for some research I find interesting, is to say, well, economic policy is obviously very political, and hence the moral psychology, I would say, pervades how everyone reacts intuitively on a primal level to suggestions for improving economic outcomes. This is, I would certainly claim, true for real people. Is it true for academics? I have an example later in case you wondered whether academics are real people. Don't be surprised. But now sort of the question I want to raise here for the remainder of the talk is really, what does this imply? If you believe me with this picture and that is a useful perspective, what does this imply for how, first, our models of economic policy have been built in the past, and then how should they be built in the future? And I'll fail on that, but I'll give myself 20 minutes to say what I think. So in my PhD, like quite a few years ago now, I did already try to voice this concern that the neoclassical economic theory I at least learned as a graduate student from the textbook has some sort of liberation bias. It needn't have that. I don't believe that, this is an in principle problem, but I think it's an in practice problem when the kind of thing we learned in the textbook was formed after the Second World War. And so I made the case that there are these three elements that are critically missing from the kind of textbook neoclassical theory we learn that really are needed to allow a fair evaluation of the exploitation story of capitalism. The first is, on production, we should distinguish rents from capital. The second is, if we're talking about distribution, most economic models I know lack a kind of stronger heterogeneity assumption, which you could sort of colorfully label there are social classes. And then third, I do believe with all the talk of critiques of a materialist lifestyle in our society, if we think about consumption, typically the normative theories that enter our economics reasoning do not assume that consumption is welfare enhancing. Sorry, they don't give a good way to make a claim that consumption isn't welfare enhancing, which is, of course, the kind of critique of a materialist lifestyle. So my first claim is then that a reform of economic theory needs to be fair to those exploitation concerns. Here's an example of what I have in mind on the production side. When a graduate student, I read this exchange between Paul Krugman and Greg Mankey. And Krugman wrote the following, even pre-Donald Trump, that the George W. Bush administration benefited of the unearned, the tax cuts of that administration benefited the unearned income of coupon clippers. I mean, he's talking John Maynard Keynes here, and heirs to large real estate, and that America's nascent oligarchy may not be fully formed, but one of the two main political parties already seems to committed to defending that oligarchy's interests. Now, Mankey thinks this is an outrageous claim, and Mankey wrote that Krugman here takes a policy favored by the right, the tax cuts, and attributes the most vile motives to those who advance the policy and ignores all the reasonable arguments in favor of it. And then he says there is a large body of literature in economics suggesting that an optimal tax system imposes much lower taxes on capital income than on wage income or consumption. Well, we all know that literature is very deeply embodied in public economics, but still, when I read this exchange as a graduate student, I thought that's somehow silly. They're talking past each other. Obviously, Krugman is talking about rentiers, while Mankey is talking about entrepreneurs on the side of production here. And that's a very large scholarly and also political debate. Are the rich in our society, those who own the means of production, are they rentiers? And neoclassical economics even driven that word out of the canon of what we learn. Or are they more entrepreneurs? And I believe, there's some good arguments for the two, but typically the economic growth models, at least I studied, do not allow for the possibility there are rents on fixed factors, where in the 21st century, land obviously will be a hard constraint on much of what humanity will do, as will the atmosphere, which is also a fixed factor. But as today is not so serious, I would say even something like the International Olympic Committee or perhaps the FIFA are really rent-generating machines because to possess something unique people care so much about. So they also kind of sit on the rents from a fixed factor, if you like. So in some work I finished while I was at INET, I, in this context, proved the following claims that if we entertain a notion in our growth models where we have both rents from fixed factors and capital income in the more typical side, then we can establish that when taxing the land rents, so the rents, this can at cases be sufficient for a national optimum of productive public investment. And also more towards climate, in situations where, kind of broadly speaking, which I believe to be true in a development context, there's insufficient capital accumulation, then carbon pricing increases economic growth because it decreases the rents on fixed factors. So we can actually do the rent taxation and still have more growth rather than get into a kind of debate, do we need to curtail growth to save the environment? So much for the first. Here's the second. Where are the social classes? So, I'm sometimes puzzled by this literature of economic inequality in the theoretical models, because why do the standard models of income and wealth inequality only allow for typically heterogeneity in earnings ability or some sort of idiosyncratic shocks? And I've thought about this quite a while, but I do think it does conform more with a liberation story, because if you don't make your agents too different from each other, actually have an easier time to say you don't need so much market regulation to deliver more equality or to deliver a good life for all. While on the other hand, there's, historically what I would associate with Marxism, and the element for all its faults of Marxism I like is the quite blunt statement, there are social classes. The rich behave really very differently from the poor, which I think this is not to be denied in empirical reality. And for example, Ernst Fehr and colleagues again last year documented once again, many times been done, the richer households have way lower discount factors when they take savings decisions. So they are really quite different from the poor. So in this context, in the past years, I wrote this paper to say when the super rich are really depicted as very different from everyone else, then capital tax finance public investment increases welfare and at the same time can lower wealth inequality. But you do need a notion of social classes to get up here if you want to find this result. Else you don't really overcome this bias in the literature to say capital taxation isn't really doing so much to reduce inequality. And in an unpublished contribution, where we go a bit further and sort of make the super rich really only rentiers, not also entrepreneurs, then we show that asset prices increase with wealth inequality. So the asset prices actually increase because there's more wealth inequality if we have this kind of notion of rentiers up. And this way, it hurts the poor via greater housing costs. Now, my co-author claims he's made a fortune from applying that theory to the stock market. He hasn't fully convinced me, but we'll see whether he'll do that at some point in the future. So that's where are the social classes. And now I've done production. This was inequality. Now here's consumption. As a third point, I would like to raise the big claim that actually most economics I find does not properly allow for consumption to also reduce, not increase well-being. Obviously, let me hasten to add, not all economics, contribution by Thorsten Veblen and Fred Hirsch, the social limits to growth, are obviously very well established. And the kind of status seeking they portray is an important element in that. But essentially, I see this problem with neoclassical economics as a consequence of the naive view of preference satisfaction, where whatever people choose makes them better off is really what's behind this idea of revealed preferences. Now, certainly, post-2000, important and orthodox economists have written about how the preference satisfaction view does allow for consumption being harmful to the self. So I'm talking here about, your own consumption is not good for you. I'm not talking about any externalities or market failures. So important and established people have done that in the formal theories. My concern is more that why I think almost every day do most researchers I meet refuse to see merit in all the three schools of thought we have had at least for a century around individual well-being. One is preference satisfaction, one is happiness, and one is capabilities. And the typical economist I meet thinks preference satisfaction is the way to go. The others are completely out of the picture. The typical cognitive scientist, neuroscientist, psychologist I see, they entertain a notion of welfare close to well-being, close to happiness, dismiss the other two. And a kind of development scholar, social scientist really likes capabilities and think the other two are totally ridiculous. And I think we should talk a bit more to each other, and it'd be great if we could all see that there are three, that all these three views on individual well-being have merit. By way of my own doings, as long as I've been part of INET, I wrote a bit on endogenous preferences to say, well, if education of tastes does preoccupy society, then it may well induce the low carbon tastes. And a contribution with Cameron and another contribution with Cameron and others, we suggest that when policies such as carbon prices or infrastructure investment are set at the conventional level you would derive in environmental or public economics, then they're inefficient once we consider the case that the preferences also change by these policies. More recently, my attention is a bit more on which some in the environmental literature would call the behavioral environmental second best, which is relevant here in a recent contribution with Franziska, who I think is here. We sort of bluntly show to the economists that you can save your health and the climate by eating less meat. And in an earlier one by Simona, which many of you know, we build a formal model to show, in how far you can save your own health and the climate by cycling more and using the car less in urban transport. But that's still, I have many discussions with economists who they kind of do find this viewpoint, although behavioral economics has been around for a long time, quite difficult to swallow, frankly. So that's about the first part. I just wanted to point out that briefly, perhaps also to the more junior members, in a recent contribution by Sam Bowles and Andy Cullen, who of course closely associated with us here at INET, they do sort of pick up on quite a number of these elements. So I would certainly claim that my list of sort of 3 leanings towards liberation are complete. And I'm not in the area they also write about here in this list. I don't have much to say about labor markets or financial economics. I think this is cut off on the screen, but so they had a piece in the Journal of Economic Literature last autumn about what students learn in economics and how that should change. And so I was relieved to see sort of much of what they say on economic rents or environmental sustainability and behavioral economics is actually quite similar. So, but why do I think this is in some way old economic thinking? And I'm grateful for, when Eric presents the Institute, he often also makes that point that in this sense, I would say getting this liberation bias out of neoclassical economics requires, in a sense, a return to things that were there before. Because if you read the top journals we now have, but you read them pre-1970, those top journals are full of debates about the role of economic rents, about heterogeneity assumptions, and about individual well-being, and other things, of course. But it seems to me there's something was lost in the past 50 years, that we kind of don't have these debates anymore about, given you have an economic policy problem, what's the right theory? There should be competing theory frameworks on these things, while typically we're kind of just left with one orthodox approach. And if you don't follow that specific approach, then you're actually not sort of supposed to be there in these journals. So that's, in a sense, the old economic thinking, where, if we bring this to life, I think it's, how should I not say, once I've written on all these matters, it's intellectually very interesting. It's stimulating. I think it'll be fairer towards people's primal intuitions about capitalism and economic policy if we had these different frameworks justifying such claims around exploitation concerns for economic policy. But in a sense, what I'll do now is sort of still more speculative and perhaps more crazy to say, well, sure, these intellectual debates are interesting, but we have no time. We have the planet to save. The carbon clock is ticking, and do I really want to spend my next 20 years on these debates, which are highly interesting, but will they really deliver a theory to save the climate? So here is this new economic thinking then what's needed? I don't know. Let me start with something that's slightly more old, economic thinking in a kind of father-son conflict, because in German, at least, the PhD advisor is also called the father of your doctorate. So when I discussed this with Ottmar Edenhofer a few years ago, these 2 stories, Jonathan Haidt walks around saying capitalism is either liberation or exploitation. He put it into the International Panel of Social Progress to say either we've got capitalism has liberated humans from many material scarcities or developed these harmful dynamics, but then sort of concluded from that, well, good. So, now there should be this third way. Of course, we have to keep capitalism. We should put effective controls on it, which would imply large changes from the status quo, like provide public goods, enhance effective environmental policy, cooperate internationally to control corporate power, and provide efficient forms of redistribution. And I would agree, how would I not, that that's good economics. These are the key policy proposals you do need if you want to deliver something like like sustainable development. The project of sustainable development would be to do these things. I agree, it's good economics. However, I have my doubt, and that's partly the conflict, to say if we just state it this way, we're not overcoming the kind of bias to our own type of moral language if we present it this way. And this is sort of what I'm more interested in, because I do believe these economic policy proposals, they're all known. And while I agree with them, and we should do more to promote them, that's in some sense not the kind of new economic thinking I'm advocating. So claim 2, then, I want to sort of suggest in all seriousness that progress on economics and environmental policy specifically, I do think we need some reform of policy appraisal. For progress with environmental policy, I think it's very problematic, this idea of we need to do environmental protection, it's to save the planet, so too often gets associated with the exploitation story. So the people who are deeply embedded in the liberation story on capitalism don't really take it serious. And so for a kind of more short and midterm political compromise on climate, on all the other environmental perils, I think we do need a different approach, which is a reform program for the liberation. My apologies. We need a different approach, which is different, which is not what I've done up to here, which is the reform program for the liberation-dominated neoclassical economics. So I'm going to ask the question in the remainder of my time then, is policy appraisal really fair? And here I might speak against more my own camp. How would you probably not agree with the first part about exploitation biases in the way we typically assess policy instruments? And I do think the kind of liberationist, I've called it this way, moral intuitions are difficult to address in the kind of typical welfare economics frameworks we have. Real concerns by people who sit in a narrative of capitalism as liberation around liberty, autonomy, distrust of government, think of all the corruption, the state failures, are not well represented in our social welfare conceptions or our social welfare analysis. And so then the morality of, if you go further, of authority and loyalty are even harder to address in economics frameworks. And with my favorite, the carbon price, as you all know, classical policy instruments to cure market failures, such as corrective taxes, are intuitively unattractive for the liberation view. And so that got me thinking, is that perhaps sort of not much more what we need to make progress on? I'll have 3 examples. Then I'll have the kind of idea I have for what that implies for revising the policy proposals, and then I conclude. So here are the 3 examples. This is perhaps an example many of you already know, which is from an important paper in social psychology a few years back, which really tries to document not only on climate, on various other issues I haven't put in here, that people are not problem averse. They're happy to acknowledge the problem, but they're really sort of solution averse in this. And so bluntly, they show here in a US context, the Republicans do not doubt climate change, but they really don't like carbon taxes. And that's sort of why they have a problem with climate change. So the experiment they did was to ask for the credibility of climate science, depending on the proposed solution. People got primed with saying, this is the solution. What do you think of climate change? Now, logically, we all know facts should not be influenced by moral values, but as an outcome, they show psychologically not so, because this is what they show. To say, here is a bunch of Democrats and Republican subjects in the US, and we're looking at a case where these subjects have been primed by either saying the solution to climate change is markedly friendly, it's more nuclear powers and technological innovation, clean energy subsidies, versus there should be government regulation, the solution is a carbon tax. You see that those who identify as Democrats are not much moved in their agreement with climate change science. You see, however, that with the Republicans who kind of associate with a more libertarian liberation values, perhaps, you see that with a market-friendly solution, there's such an obvious difference as if they're primed with the carbon tax in their agreement with climate change science. If they're primed with the carbon tax as a solution, they suddenly doubt the physics or the ecology. And that got me thinking along the lines, reading this example, that this sort of somehow must be the problem with, why are we not making more progress when economists do economic policy proposals? It might be a bit of an American story, happy to discuss, but I do believe if this is sort of how real people react to policy proposals, we're getting something wrong if we're not acknowledging this more in our theories. Now, here's the bit, if you think, okay, but I'm a social science scholar, am I really fair enough, this is how real people react to policy proposals and priming, but surely the academics do better? Well, here's another paper by Jonathan Haidt to say, this does also happen to economists on value-free or on the empirical economics. So they have this paper to say, finally, our survey data shows responses to basic moral judgment, moral propositions can be used to predict responses to empirical positive economic propositions. So, for example, they show in this paper how much importance a practicing economist, an economics professor, assigns to the moral foundation of care. How much would you like other people not to get hurt? Predicts their views on empirical questions. For example, on complicated empirical questions, whether austerity is good or bad for economic growth. whether a single-payer healthcare system would reduce national healthcare costs or not, whether minimum wage laws benefit or harm workers, all important policy debates. These are, as they stand, empirical questions, not normative questions, but still your answer tends to depend on, as they show in a large sample of economists, the kind of moral views you take. So economists' substantive conclusions about the workings of the economy rather than their suggestions and regulation also correlate with their moral values. And finally, more to my own home of welfare and public economics, I also have this sort of long-standing issue with sort of some way how these problems are set up. So first, many people do not realize a utilitarian social welfare function, which isn't liked much. Many social science scholars think somehow utilitarian isn't egalitarian enough, but that in itself is highly redistributive until the marginal utilities are equalized. And so, for example, in climate, in an integrated assessment model, if you have a truly unconstrained social utilitarian social planner, it'll obviously recommend immense amounts of global redistribution, even besides the climate issue. So here I would like to criticize one very influential way in my own field where this was done in public economics, which is the Merle's model of optimal income taxation. Because I would agree that many, perhaps for some of the concerns around government failures, corruption, inefficient bureaucracy, would say no, full equalization, redistribution up to the utilitarian point is a silly idea. But I somehow don't think the real reason we think that is sort of what Merle's introduced, which is the idea of incentive compatibility constraints. So rather, I'm going to argue what's needed here is some sort of revision of rational choice political economy in two fronts. The one front is to say it should be truer to how do real people actually act to policy proposals? Why do they vote for the economic policies they vote for? And then also a very well-known problem in that field is to say, how do you make it normatively cogent? How do you get actually an argument out of a model of what real people do to say this is still sort of normatively founded policy advice? What do we learn from a political economy model for talking to politicians, basically? So there's one recent example which I like for that reason, though that it does seem to be fair to different concerns about policy evaluation, which is this idea of nudging, or as they coined it, Thaler and Sunstein, libertarian paternalism. Let's take stock in half a minute. I do agree nudges are highly effective in influencing people's behavior. However, although those two guys might not see it in this way, I think the majority of social science people would say they fail in solving major social and environmental problems because they're very, very micro. They have to be very targeted, very much to one single case. So it's very difficult to say, oh, wealth inequality or climate change will solve that by nudging. The best people in philosophy of economics, if you read them, tell you actually their terminology, their welfare theory is conceptually totally flawed. It's really fuzzy what they've written about nudges and libertarian paternalism. But still, what I admire about their project is to say, I believe they did take the political psychology on board in the right way, because the evidence we had from how policymakers in various countries have taken this up on the past 15 years is nudges seem to appeal to both stories about capitalism, somehow as autonomy enhancing and as welfare enhancing. So I admire what they've done for that reason. Not for the others, not for their concepts, but for the reason that somehow I think they got that right. And here's my own hypothesis, which is slightly different, but I would argue that philosophically, policy instruments, like all other entities, they're entities, they're in our theories of social science, have properties, as anything in metaphysics. And so only a subset of these properties is our economic properties in a stricter sense, like efficiency, like changes to income distribution. And this is how economists appear so weird to everyone else in society, because they focus in their analysis on the economic properties of these policy instruments rather than all other properties, which could be, how are they named? Which politician defends them? Which worldview are they associated with? Are they prone to lobbying? And so there are a lot of other properties which appeal to individuals' favorite worldviews and narratives, and economists tend to ignore that. And here's, I think, where we need to make progress, perhaps in our theories, but perhaps even more. And some people, of course, do this when they give policy advice. Some people we like, but I think we can also be somewhat more explicit in research, in doing research to acknowledge this. So some papers I've written more recently somehow try to prepare the ground for this, where in my work with David Krenat, we really say, if you want to design successful carbon tax reforms, mind that citizens find the Pigouvian idea completely unintuitive. Citizens don't really understand why putting a price on pollution should reduce pollution. In a contribution with German co-authored, I've argued that the fairness in carbon tax design in Germany really means to do the lump sum revenue recycling, while in other countries it might not mean that. In a contribution with Jackson, who I think is in the audience, the contribution is motivated by the idea to say citizens might ignore revenue recycling, especially in country contexts where they have low trust in government. They might ignore that, or the government might promise some revenue recycling to make the policy more equal, but they might actually not believe the government. And so we show that in such cases, intensity standards or emission standards might actually then have better distributional consequences than pricing on environmental policy. And finally, in another contribution with David and Francisca, we also sort of toy with the idea, might the pandemic change how we get citizens on board for some of the policies we need to save the planet, and perhaps also change scientific policy advice. So 2 final proposals and then conclusion. Here, some hypotheses I have on the policies we need. On climate, I'd like to sort of explore once again, how does an emission trading system actually interact with people's values? And I think there's no research on that really. But it is interesting if you listen to people's discussion, to policy discussions on emission trading, that one half of the society basically tells me, oh, it's too market-based. It's, sounds like a very free market instrument, and also it's very prone to industry lobbying. While on the other hand, for many people, they still, at least if it follows through our climate targets, sounds like much too much government intervention, right? Raising the EU ETS targets. Oh, the price is going to go up, and sort of this is sort of some sort of socialism. This can't be right. So perhaps this is a new argument why emissions trading, although most of my colleagues in environmental economics currently prefer taxes, they're much more fashionable, is interesting for making progress on climate, because the tax is so much seen as a classical exploitationist instrument. On the other hand, more to talking towards inequality, I find it fascinating that redistribution for many people seems to converge so much on the appeal of everyone should get the same. As a kind of misguided belief, there are studies to show people greatly underestimated how unequal our societies actually are. People think they're much more equal than they actually are. And it's interesting that a lump sum payment seems compatible with a wide variety of motives, of moral motives of redistribution or inequality. And so this is my guess, why there's in some circles so much of an obsession with universal basic income. Well, because it ticks so many policy properties, very different communities, very different people like. And I wonder, and I'm not fully convinced this is actually the same for a kind of fee and dividend approach to reducing emissions. Here's the agenda. Here's what I want to do in the next 5 and then perhaps the next 50 years. So derived from what I said in the last 10 minutes, models of public support for carbon pricing high on my agenda for my future research. Also perhaps more on changing the narratives around environmental policy instruments to be about health. What do people really think about emissions trading? In an equivalent contribution, I'd really like to think more about, say, city tolls versus low emission zones, and think about how can we make city tolls really work for citizens. And I think there's a big contribution to be made around instrument choice under the political economy in low and middle income countries, which is heavily understudied. So for example, how do we model trust in government, trust that the government will follow through an economic policy recipe as a constraint? And then for the next 50 years, then the next 5 years, theory of policy properties might take me a while. I am interested also in rents in the labor market, haven't spoken about that today, and what that has to do with the economics of meaning. Wealth inequality, where preferences are endogenous, about altruism seems interesting. Animals enter the social welfare function, well, that will take a while. And in all seriousness, I finally want to explore at some point whether real well-being of a human being is not happiness or not preferences, but it could actually derive from a notion of wisdom. So that's what I intend to do, is the next part of this project. This is really a talk about all I want to do. Let me just finish on the point. You might object to some of what I say, but saying, look, Linus, timescales, grand social narrative can be changed. It's been possible. It has happened that narratives, even some basic narratives about something like, is capitalism more exploitation or liberation, can be changed. And yes, I agree, important people in the history of our subjects, from John Maynard Keynes to Joshua Green, believe they can be transformed. And it's because there is no, coming back to what I said, the introduction, there is no intuitive dictatorship. There's primacy, but no dictatorship. And often you can trace you can trace in the history that arguments actually predated intuition. Someone had to make an argument why something is wrong before there could be a mass movement, and people find it very intuitive. But that doesn't satisfy me somehow, because I think the progress with the climate and other environmental problems is much more urgent, and instead we should seek innovative policy solutions addressing the elements from working with the stories we currently have, basically. So what's then the eschatology of capitalism? Third way proposals are nothing new in the sense, and I'm not in that sense advocating a third way proposal, where on the one hand, on the future of capitalism, you have Piketty. Piketty reminded us we get to some sort of Ricardian apocalypse. Ricardo was talking about this difficulty for the economy, that somehow you have an economy dominated by rents. And Piketty wrote about how an economy dominated by what I would call urban and climate rentiers and social inequalities dominated by inheritance, not achievement, is really the kind of apocalypse we might face if we don't get the policies right. While Haidt will perhaps argue for something, as he said, decent, what he might call decent dynamism, he would argue that capitalism is so successful because it generates all this innovation, which has made the world so much richer. The one problem is it also generates innovations of exploitation. So we must kind of find ways to steer the innovation away from exploitations. I just have a footnote here, no claim on how to avoid the Ricardian apocalypse, because the psychologists, communicators will tell the academics, if it sounds good to us, it's almost surely wrong for the public. They tell me that all the time. Now, if you think Linus has gone completely mad with his talk, totally crazy, why does he not stick to his economics and his econ theory, where he actually had some moderate success doing that? Well, I do think we can't just leave it to them, but we have to work with we still sort of need the econ theory of instrument choice to do this right, to deliver anything effective. Else they might tell us how to frame things in a language that might appeal to broader audiences, but that sort of doesn't abolish the idea to say, once we take that as a premise, as the premise should be to save the planet first, then we still need to work together with them. So, summary, I've argued, underlying much of what I do is this idea, there are really just two grand stories about capitalism around: liberation and exploitation. And I've made the claims, three claims, how this might or might not influence our research agenda. Reform of economic theory need to be fair to exploitation concerns. The neoclassical textbook stuff is not, I would think. This is why I'm at INET. But reform of policy appraisal methods actually need to address the liberation concerns. And so the latter, I do wish to make the claim, seems now more important to me for the environment compared to when I entered INET, when I was still coming out of a PhD. And so I would argue here for the future of myself and the Institute and all others who might be concerned, the new economic thinking should really find innovative ways of including broader moral motives in economic models. It's my time to go. It's been a long time at INET with many great academic and more personal experiences. And the motto here, may you first open hearts and then minds, I think is also a very good model to run an institute. And in that case, I have to thank very many good people for our joint time. And especially I should thank, I think we're here, Susan and Eric, for their support over the years. But also, you won't get rid of me completely. I'm still looking forward to many of them who are in the pictures here and who are in the audience, I know, for further collaborations over the next years, even if I'm not a full member anymore. Thank you so much for your attention.